this year marks the 50th anniversary of the process of decolonization on the African continent. So a cohort of African countries this year have been celebrating 50 years of independence. So it's an important moment, but also that the South African Communist Party, in fact, yesterday was celebrating 89 years of unbroken struggle in South Africa and its own contributions on the African continent. And that would not have been possible without the contribution of many internationalists, including some in this room, who've made huge contributions for making the South African Revolution possible in 1994. So on behalf of the party, on behalf of the 100,000 odd members of the party, we also want to thank you for that part. One is the issue of militarism, and in particular as represented by US militarism. In fact, the US is also seeking to expand its bases on the African continent. All of us will know that the US has, for the last 3 or so many years, put together a military base which is currently in the US, but it is seeking to locate it on the African continent called AFRICOM. And the purpose of AFRICOM is basically very clear, to send a particular message of US militarism on the continent. But it has particular contradictions, as we'll try to demonstrate later on. But also the issue of intra-imperial rivalries that was mentioned earlier on. Intra-imperial rivalries in the form of trade, political, and interrelated aspects between, on one hand, the United States, and on the other hand, the EU. For example, this relates to the EU's economic partnership agreements and the United States AGOA, which it calls the African Growth Opportunity Act. These are at the level of trade, at the level of seeking to exploit the resources of that continent. Both the US and the EU are seeking through these particular mechanisms to penetrate the African continent. And of course, it's for purposes of increasing the profit margins and etc., etc. But also there's another phenomenon, a very subtle phenomenon, which is, and we've seen this recently, that former colonizers, such as France, which organized a meeting recently of Francophone-speaking countries in Paris, and speaking to them, suggesting that, you know, we have a lot in common, we have a language in common, culture, and a whole range of things. Therefore, out of that, we think you must gravitate with us in respect of a whole range of things, trade, etc., etc., etc. But interestingly now, Sarkozy also invited to this meeting the president of South Africa, which is an Anglophone former colony. But also there's the issue of the so-called dragon on the African continent, the role of China and China's penetration on the African continent. We want to argue that we need to make a distinction between Chinese state capital manifesting in the state-owned enterprises in China, which are coming onto the continent and seeking to form partnerships and etc. with a variety of states. In one instance, not so very good alliances they're forging, but also private individual capital that comes from Hong Kong and also Taiwan. So Taiwanese private capital on the back of People's Republic of China has actually advanced and penetrated the African continent in a significant way. And therefore it will act differently to, we would want to argue, to Chinese state-owned capital. And also private capital that comes from Hong Kong would act different, we want to argue, to that state-owned capital from the People's Republic of China, because the People's Republic of China could probably have instruments to discipline capital that is related to the state, and would not have the mechanisms to discipline private capital that comes from Hong Kong and Taiwan. So we put in this matter so that it also assists us to better understand China's engagement on the African continent itself, and therefore why both US and EU imperialism are seeking to present China as as this monster that is seeking to overwhelm all of the African continent. Whereas even on the African continent, there are other countries, there are other economies that are embracing China to a certain extent. That capital is also contributing as a catalyst in infrastructure development in those countries. Is that even on the continent, there are others who are using the anti-imperialist rhetoric to perpetuate torturous regimes, and some regimes who are culprits of human rights, etc., have actually used the anti-imperialist rhetoric very effectively. For example, if you look at the case of al-Bashir, successfully using the anti-imperialist, anti-US rhetoric very successfully. But the contradictions in the context of the Sudan itself are exacerbating a whole range of other things, which could, in 2011, see the breakup of Sudan into Northern Sudan and Southern Sudan. The issue of the Darfur hasn't been resolved itself. Alongside that is also maybe a favorite topic of the people of Britain, Robert Mugabe using anti-imperialist rhetoric himself to continue his rule in Zimbabwe. And our take in respect of that is that Robert Mugabe and ZANU-PF are a clear manifestation, a classical manifestation of a denuding of a progressive national liberation movement. Meaning a former progressive national liberation movement has lost all its progressive credentials and integrity and has become an instrument of torture, murder, and oppression against its own people. That's what there's an election coming up in Rwanda in September. And we're reading and monitoring the situation in Rwanda very closely. And we're seeing that there's a campaign against the opponents of the ruling clique in Rwanda. But not a finger is raised about that authoritarian dictatorship by the US and British. They're not raising a finger about that. They're not raising a finger about the fact that Paul Kagame is on a murderous campaign against his own people. That's a contradiction of imperialism as it manifests on the continent. Then what is the response of the people in respect of these particular challenges? We want to argue that consolidating the efforts of the people to wage a concerted and coordinated struggle against imperialism is very important. We're also arguing that it is important to build international networks with like-minded organizations in the developed world. For example, the conference that will be held in Lisbon in November is very important, and it allows us to basically take the work forward in that regard. Finally, supporting and consolidating international progressive fraternal organizations such as the World Peace Council and its affiliates is very important. In the African continent, post-national independence, most of these important mass movements were condensed into the state and or used as an extension of the state. So all their independence and progressiveness could have been lost in the process. Therefore, we think it's important to make some form of contribution in these types of organizations and build a broad mass movement that has the progressive credentials, that has a progressive integrity to undertake this. And of course, as you were saying, South Africa will be hosting the 17th Festival of Youth and Students, organized by WUFD in December. We think it's important for the South African Communist Party and its youth league to use that as a platform to take the message beyond just South Africa onto the continent in respect of building these important forces against imperialism. Socialism is the future, build it now. Amandla.